I'm not sure, but I'm assuming many people that are coming into the webinar know me, Peter Ashworth, Director of the Institute for Energy Transition. And I'm very excited to be hosting this discussion today with Emily Grubert, managing the mid-transition from fossil fuels to zero carbon. Emily and I have had a bit of a chat before, and she comes highly recommended and actually has some oversight of WA and some, but I think, or of Australia more broadly, I should say. But I think the topic and the way that Emily approaches this is really relevant to Australia in transition. But before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge the Whadjuk elders, past and present, as the traditional owners of the Noongar Boodja, on which CIET is located, and just acknowledge the wonderful knowledge, the tens of thousands of years of knowledge that they bring to us here, and also working with the opportunity for participating in the energy transition, which I think is really exciting for everybody as rights holders of the land across Australia. So everyone would have read Emily's bio, but I'll just quickly give a very light oversight. Emily, Associate Professor of Sustainable Energy Policy and concurrently of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Earth Sciences at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. Her research focuses on justice-oriented deep decarbonisation and decision support tools for large infrastructure systems. And she holds a PhD in environmental resources from Stanford. So I think a perfect person to have at this time, Emily. So welcome. I'm going to hand over to you, and we'll look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you everybody for spending parts of your morning with me. I'm always delighted to get to talk to people, especially at institutes that seem like they might actually be really good potential fits for lots of future conversations. So really glad to be here. I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes or so, and then hopefully have some good discussion at the end of that. But basically, what I'd like to kind of lay out over the next 25 minutes or so is my essential thesis on what it looks like from an infrastructure perspective to be really thinking very carefully about how we move from a fossil fuel-based system to a zero carbon-based system. As Peter mentioned, I have actually done a little bit of work in Australia. It's been quite a long time, but this is going to be a pretty US-centric set of examples, at least. I think the examples are pretty American, but the actual situation, and I think a lot of the diagnosis is actually quite common to most places that have been industrialized for a while. The kind of thing that I'm going to be talking about applies a little bit less directly to places that maybe haven't been industrialized for quite so long and don't have quite as much of a legacy infrastructure history. But I think many of the themes in general about just how we think about going from a system that's primarily fossil fuel to a system that is basically none is going to work out over the next little while. So to start out, I think one of the things that I really like to set as a frame is that sustainability is normative. And what I mean by that is basically that this is a situation where we're moving toward a specific goal. The reason that I want to start with this is because I think as I talk a little bit about what the modeling system looks like here, what the policy situation looks like here as we start thinking about moving away from fossil fuels, it's really important to remember that we actually do have an end goal here. That doesn't mean that there's not a lot of space for co-creation with community and really trying to make sure that this is something that people are able to engage with. But the overall goal of a transition to zero carbon is to eliminate carbon. And I think keeping sight of that, especially in a policy context, actually tends to be pretty difficult just in terms of what people are willing to talk about, but ends up being really important to the way that we think about planning this. So point being, we know where we are now and we know where we're trying to go. Whether we're aligned on where we're trying to go is a different question, but I'm going to be talking as though we are all intending to reach a zero carbon future. I think the immediate thing that follows that is that reaching zero greenhouse gas emissions requires basically shutting down about 80% of the world's energy system. That's the proportion of our sort of marketed energy. I'm not including things like light coming in through your windows, all these other sorts of things that do provide energy services, but the sort of the marketed energy in the world is about 80% fossil fuel based. What's amazing about this statistic, I think, is just how clear it makes the actual goal. Like, we're not actually talking about trying to improve efficiency at some power plants. We're not talking about a minor shift in the way that we handle transportation. We're talking about reshaping the energy system. And this is, I think, actually a really scary thing in some ways, but it's also actually a really useful thing to remember as we think about what the possibilities look like. We don't really have to engage with conversations about how we retain a lot of this infrastructure in the long term and how we ensure that it's able to keep operating for, hundreds of years to go, given that we know that we're trying to eliminate it. And again, that is a really daunting task, but it also, I think, is clarifying and really simplifies, if not, it's not easy, but it's simple what we actually do need to be doing here. I'm a civil engineer by training, and one of the things that I think is useful about an infrastructure-based view of this is just kind of putting it on maps. So I'm going to show you a couple of maps. Again, these are very US examples, but you can probably extrapolate a bit to other places. This is a map of the fossil fuel fired power plants in the United States. This is a few years old at this point, so this is what was operating as of 2018. Red in this case is natural gas, black is coal. There's a couple of those little green dots that are oil. But the reason that I show this is basically just to point out that this is a map of all of the stuff that needs to close. And this is a map specifically of things that we need to close in a way that actually retains safety characteristics, reliability characteristics, is conscious of the impact on the host communities where these places are located, all of that kind of thing. But we have a literal map of the kinds of facilities that we're talking about here. And I think contrary to some of the conversation around build out of the new replacement system, this is actually something that's actually very, very powerful because it gives us the opportunity to think really concretely about what we're talking about here. So with these plants, we know where they are, we know who works there, we know how old they are, we know what their environmental characteristics are. That gives us actually a really strong starting point for planning carefully what this transition looks like. So that's electricity. The, I think, challenging thing is, as we're talking about getting to zero, we're talking about all fossil systems. So that's also things like the transportation system. Again, this is an American example of a freeway down in Los Angeles in California. But essentially, most of our vehicle miles traveled here are based on essentially single occupancy passenger vehicles and trucks. Moving that to something that doesn't rely on fossil fuels can take a few different forms. So obviously electrification and things like that, but also questions, and this is part of the reason I use Los Angeles here, is sort of famous for its sprawl and traffic issues. We could also think about densification. We could also think about public transport. There are a lot of different kinds of opportunities really that open up when we start thinking about completely remaking a system. Again, not that that's easy, but it does, I think, open us up to a broader conversation. And then here's my favorite scary map, I think. So the United States spans a lot of different climate zones. I think in Australia, you are familiar with the issues of cross-continent country size, but we have a lot of cold places. We also have a lot of hot places. What this map is essentially showing is where we use fossil fuels directly for heating and where we use things like electricity. So in this map, yellow is electricity. The sort of purple is natural gas and propane, and then red is oil. But what this is essentially showing is that in the cold places, we're quite reliant on fossil fuels directly for heating. This is probably the thing that makes me the most concerned about transitioning the fossil system in a way that is safe and preserves reliability, preserves human access to opportunity, dignity, these kinds of things, just because the challenge of heating in very cold places is actually extraordinarily difficult when we start talking about electrification and things like this. So there's a lot of opportunities to think about building efficiency, but fundamentally, if we're talking about moving to a system that is capable of delivering zero emissions, there's actually quite a bit of technological progress that needs to be made in addition to really thinking very carefully about safety. The new replacement system in this context fails, people will die. And so really thinking about this from that perspective and realizing this isn't just about meeting least cost or fastest rollout or something like that. This is actually a life safety problem in many cases. I think this is the most clear with the heating question. It's also true with electricity and transportation. But these are sort of the three big systems that we're talking about when we think about shutting down existing fossil infrastructure. So all of that is to say, my basic premise with this whole mid-transition concept is essentially that there's going to be quite a long time, hopefully as short as we can make it, and I'll talk about that a little bit, where these systems have to coexist with a growing replacement system as they shrink. So we don't really have a situation where we have a fully mature, fully healthy fossil infrastructure that's kind of there providing its services while we build out the new system. We actually have a major, and often life safety critical system in decline that is being, again, normatively replaced by something in a way that is going to probably be a little unstable in the middle. And so my essential point here is that this is something that we need to plan very carefully, because if you don't, the chaos that emerges from not actually having a replacement system is potentially actually quite consequential. I think one of the other things that's, again, this is a US example, but I think we find this in many places, and I think Australia is actually one of the better examples of this internationally, is that fossil fuels are deeply culturally embedded. So it's not just a matter of switching over fuel systems or switching over the way that we govern our energy systems. It's also really about thinking about how these systems engage with people in their places. This is from a project that I did a while ago that basically looked at fiction books by American authors that dealt with either oil or coal as characters or settings or whatever else. And I think the point that I want to make here is just that there's generally in literature even this sort of latent acknowledgement that oil is a really exciting thing that creates a lot of wealth and a lot of opportunity. By contrast, and if you read these quotes, you can kind of see coal is typically treated as something that is extraordinarily present and is really difficult to escape, but nonetheless is quite dangerous and has a lot of really negative consequences. But in either case, you see these resources showing up in all sorts of cultural contexts, whether that's music, literature, art, these kinds of things, in a way that I think really illustrates that this is not just a technology change. This isn't just, someone wants a better phone and so we give them a different phone. This is something where people often have pretty significant ties. So all of this is to say, as we start thinking about decarbonization, that includes what I call a mid-transition, where essentially you have both carbon-based systems and zero-carbon systems. The carbon-based system is getting smaller, the zero-carbon system is getting larger, and what I argue is essentially that this requires coordination. You cannot have a chaotic transition that is successful if your normative goals are things like reaching zero emissions, but also things like ensuring safety, ensuring a just transition, ensuring equity, these types of things. If you want this to work well, you actually have to plan. I think the other big point here is that this mid-transition is much more chaotic than the endpoints. And I think that from a policy perspective, this is actually a really important thing to be able to communicate. And it's one that, at least here, most people are not super excited about trying to communicate. It's very hard to go to your constituents and essentially say, for the next 10 years, next 20 years, maybe, we're actually going to be in a situation that's probably more expensive than what we're doing, probably less reliable than what we're doing, lots and lots of things like that, where you have systems that are operating in ways that they weren't designed for, essentially. So at the endpoints where you have a primarily fossil system or a primarily zero carbon system, both of those systems can operate the way that they were designed. You can really engage your governance structures and your metrics and those types of things in a way that's designed to work well with these systems. In the middle, you have to do things that are consistent with both, which means that you're going to be compromising in both cases. That's chaotic. It's difficult to track what's going on, all of those types of things. And I think we're already starting to see some of these consequences at a point where we haven't really entered the mid-transition, at least in the US, but I think most other places too. One of the ways that I describe this state is basically that both systems, the fossil system and the non-fossil system, are too small to support everything. So you need them both, but they're both too big to operate without affecting the other one. So this is things like solar power having to curtail in the middle of the day because certain kinds of thermal plants are unable to ramp down that quickly. But it's also things like natural gas-fired power plants, at least here, needing to turn on and off really quickly to accommodate a lot of the renewables that come on in the middle of the day. So we're already seeing those kinds of things. That's just an inherent feature of this process. You're never going to be able to go from fully fossil to fully non-fossil overnight, but it is something that I think is really important to understand as we think about what to expect over these next periods. Maladaptations, I think in general, are pretty likely in this case. So you're running things at lower efficiency, you're running things at higher costs than they maybe would be optimally. The metrics that you're using to assess whether the system is operating is probably going to miss things. One of the things, though, and especially something that I tell my engineering students a lot, is that these are really actually pretty predictable. And that's a strength of this situation. It's easy to look at this and say, we can't see this coming. There are all these black swan events that we need to plan for. In practice, though, I would argue that many of these maladaptations and their consequences are pretty predictable if we try. So spending some time doing things like actually studying energy transition, which is partially why I'm so excited to be engaging with this institute, this is a really important thing to be doing. The other big point here is that essentially you have to be operating duplicative systems. While you've got both running, they both need to be able to do similar tasks. In this case, one, the fossil system is declining, the other, the non-fossil system is growing. That's actually really hard because you can't reach a stable state. So actually figuring out how to operate is going to engage a lot of really important problem solving needs that really try to address this issue of a constantly changing system until you've kind of made it through to the other side. This is both expensive because you have to maintain both systems and actually difficult sort of from a labor and expertise perspective. I think one of the biggest challenges that I see is just this notion that you're probably, especially in market-based economies, you are going to see really, really significant disinvestment in the fossil system as it becomes clear that this transition is actually proceeding. Why do you want to spend money on something that you know is going to close? That's one issue that's moderately solvable if you're willing to just spend the money. The thing that I think is maybe a little bit harder, that's also an investment problem, though, is dealing with actually having people that are expert at operating these systems under very difficult conditions. We already see, I think, globally, a pretty significant decline in young people wanting to go into fossil industries for good reason. Like, I wouldn't want to do that either. I didn't. And I think, I don't know what you see necessarily, but at least in the United States, we've seen a massive drop off even in the number of petroleum engineering programs that exist, granting secondary degrees and these kinds of things. So that's really challenging. And I think that one of the things that we're likely to see is a loss of skill and a loss of expertise right at the time when we need people to be really, really good at this. Not only do you have a real change in the way that these systems are operating just kind of inherently because they're operating at different capacities and different scheduling and those types of things, but you're also dealing with progressive climate change, which makes everything harder as well. So this all combined is likely to really enhance some of the hazard right as the time where we're losing a lot of expertise. So actually planning not just on making sure that there's money here, but also that there are people here and that those people are actually able to leave and have a good future once these systems do close is going to be a pretty significant challenge. And then the last thing that I maybe want to point out here is that different parts of the energy system will enter and exit the transition at different points. So the chart on the right here is essentially just showing that in the US, we really haven't entered what I would consider a real transition yet with electricity, but this is illustrating electricity penetration by variable renewables in the United States. Electricity is probably furthest along when we think about how far through this transition we actually are. So the point that we are going to go through this, not just for electricity and not just in different locations, but also for vehicles, for heat, all these types of things. This is not a situation that we're going to get out of very quickly. All of that is to say, minimizing time in the mid-transition is desirable. I want to kind of address head on. I think a lot of the time when I talk about this, people interpret what I'm saying as, we're going to have fossil fuels around for a long time, so we better just kind of buckle in and expect this to be several decades. I think the point that I'm actually trying to make is that this is going to be hard, expensive, difficult to manage, and potentially pretty hazardous in a lot of ways. What we should be doing, given that this isn't something that you can do overnight, is really trying as hard as we can to keep the amount of time we spend in this transition period to a minimum. That is partially the argument for more coordinated planning, not letting this happen on its own, but really trying to see how are we going to sequence this, those kinds of questions. But this is hard. The other side, when we are in a system that's able to be operating in a way that's sort of designed for its characteristics from a technical perspective and from a governance perspective, is likely to be easier, cheaper, safer. So getting to that as quickly as we can is really important. All that said, also just letting fossil infrastructure close in a haphazard way without making sure that it's safe and well maintained and these kinds of things is also really complicated. So We know from a lot of different examples internationally what happens when we don't plan ahead for failures. This is a picture of actually an iron mill in the United States that was developed about 100 years ago and is now a museum facility. What's kind of fascinating about this is that one of the steel mills near my house is actually of the same vintage and is still operating. So we see a lot of infrastructure that runs much longer than we maybe intended it to. But I think this is emblematic of what we saw in the United States when our steel industry essentially collapsed in the 1980s. A lot of countries have examples like this where you see an industry that kind of departs faster than people expected it to, or in ways that were not really anticipated. Here, what this looked like was a lot of plants closing with very, very little notice to workers, very little notice to communities, things like this. One of the consequences of that is this was 40 years ago, and it's still an extraordinarily important part of our politics in the United States. Just the way that people talk about deindustrialization and so forth has really stayed pretty front and center for quite a long time. And so this point that we don't necessarily have a lot of really good examples of major industrial transitions like this, but we do have a lot of good examples of what doesn't work, I think is also sort of useful when we're looking for the negative space so as to try to find some of the positive potential things that we can do. So if this is not clear, I'm a pretty significant advocate for planning in this. Actually, kind of a spoiler, I'm running a survey right now of people that are near big power plants that are closing, basically trying to get a sense of how they react to different planning horizons. That started going out yesterday, so hopefully there will be more information about that soon. In thinking about planning, though, I think one of the things that stays so front and center for me is that this is actually dangerous not to plan. There are huge shocks that emerge when you don't actually plan for transition. There are major, major impacts to the communities that host these kinds of infrastructures and to the people that depend on them. So when we think about what a coordination function looks like or what a planning function looks like, really, I think the goal there is to really think about continuity of service, safety, those kinds of things, and then kind of work backwards from there. This is an example from a coal mining region in the United States where basically a mine shut with essentially no notice. People were starting to have their paychecks clawed back out of their direct deposits into their bank accounts. And so a lot of the miners basically set up camp on the train tracks and wouldn't let the last load go out until there was a wage payment. So to be clear, not paying people's wages is illegal, but it happens anyway. And this is actually a pretty common pattern that we see. So this is a paper that I like a lot, basically looked at US coal bankruptcies. So what they found was essentially by going bankrupt suddenly, coal miners discharged about $5 billion of retiree and environmental obligations just across 4 companies in 5 years. But this notion of kind of collapsing quickly and then using that as a way to get out of pensions and get out of environmental bonding and things like that is a pretty common pattern. One of the other things that I think is really important, at least here, is that there's a big cultural focus on coal mining as something that is kind of emblematic of this transition. The other fossil industries, at least in the United States, are quite a bit bigger. And so when we think about a lot of the chaos that we've already seen with coal here, imagining that being extended to oil and gas, power plants, refining, those types of things actually expands this quite a bit. So we've seen quite a lot of challenges associated with unplanned coal transitions. There's still a huge opportunity to do better planning for some of these other industries. And I think different countries have different patterns in this regard, but in many, many cases, there's sort of different levels of how far along some of these conversations are. And then one of the other things that we talk about a lot here from a policy perspective is just the point that a lot of energy jobs are location specific. This is true for mining too, obviously. But when we think about some of these industries transitioning, it's not often just as easy as having people get other jobs for a variety of reasons. But this also means that you may have certain communities that probably don't have much else by way of further economic activities when some of these extraction activities go away. The other point here is that abandoning high hazard infrastructure is a bad idea. So just a variety of pictures of environmental outcomes for things that weren't remediated appropriately. I think this is probably a pretty obvious one, but just having things go bankrupt, not remediating them, and not planning for closure is a really important piece. Actually, I think this is a statistic from a friend of mine that I believe is at CSIRO now, Tom Measham, but the I think the mining sector sees something like 75% of closures are unplanned, which is kind of a wild statistic to think about just in terms of how predictable it is that these infrastructures are going to close. But we don't plan for what that looks like a lot of the time. So another kind of argument for planning is just recognizing that there are real environmental hazards as well as kind of physical safety issues. This is something that we see a lot also in terms of social support for closures. This is an example from North Dakota, a big oil extraction area in the US. But basically, people in this interview project that I did would talk a lot about how some of the things that they kind of considered tolerable side effects of the extraction activities were no longer as tolerable when the money stopped. So basically making the point that there's, health issues and economic impacts to their town that actually make them much less supportive of the industry over time. So this point that you see really, really deep impacts when stuff goes away without clear planning and a clear articulation to people of what's going to happen next, I think is pretty important. So this actually requires a lot of special attention. You can't just close things. There isn't really the same opportunity that we have for other kinds of industries where just letting things close when they're no longer economically viable is okay. Like if a restaurant closes because it's not profitable, that's not that big of a deal. If your entire natural gas system closes because it's not economically viable, that's probably really dangerous. And so this is another kind of bid for planning and more coordination, just in the sense that this is a public hazard if you don't do it well. And then finally, we actually do need to make sure that the system is ready to actually back us up by the time that it's called upon. So if you don't have a new zero carbon system that's actually available to run all of these systems when the fossil system has closed, you're going to end up in some pretty challenging situations. Amazing. Sorry, I think I hit the button a little bit goofy. So just to kind of wrap in a last couple of points that I think are maybe kind of useful to characterize what I'm talking about a little bit too, is just this notion that as we think about replacement systems, we're talking about a huge amount of infrastructure. So this is not just planning for phasing out fossil, this is also planning for phasing in new systems. Again, this is an American example, but basically when you look at a lot of net zero greenhouse gas emissions pathways that rely pretty strongly on electrification, what we expect is that the amount of electricity generation capacity in this country is probably going to have to increase by a factor of 5 to 8 to accommodate all of the heating, transportation, and other kinds of things that are moving from direct fossil use to electricity. I bring this up mostly just to point out that this is actually a huge undertaking from an infrastructure perspective, and to kind of reemphasize, it's not just that we are dramatically retiring things. It's also that there's this really significant build out that needs to happen in order to make sure that services are maintained. That again kind of opens us up to a lot of pretty blue sky thinking potentially, which is both exciting and terrifying. But the end goal, I think, in keeping in mind what that looks like, really does suggest that this is not an issue of sort of incrementalism at this point. So my basic argument, and I'm excited to see if people disagree, I think this is probably one of the more controversial points that I make a lot of the time, is basically that centralized coordination probably at a federal level, maybe a global level, is necessary, but not sufficient. Just having a coordinator doesn't get you all the way there, but not being able to coordinate in some sort of centralized way really puts you at risk of major failures of infrastructure that aren't being managed. And I think one of the clearest examples that we see of that is basically that there's a lot of disaggregated decision-making authority around things like power plant closures. If the power plant owner is the person that gets to decide whether the plant closes or not, but the mine that supplies it is unaware of that, the people that use it are unaware of that, those sorts of things, it's actually really hard to make this work. So as a little bit of a sneak peek, because this is a project that we're going to be doing over the next couple of years, there are a lot of different solutions to this. Some of it is just direct fuel switching, but you can also start thinking about redesigning cities or really, really significantly focusing on things like building efficiency. Again, opening yourself up to really talking about reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions means that there are huge, huge design and governance opportunities to think about alternative ways of providing services, whether that's building heat and cooling, transportation services, those kinds of things that go far beyond just making our power plants more efficient and those kinds of things that we've typically seen as a policy focus in the past. And then finally, people are a lot more supportive of transition when it's clear that there's a plan for what's going on. This has been sort of borne out in a number of different contexts, but even though transition can be pretty challenging and can be really problematic for, the finances of a small community or something along those lines, people are actually remarkably supportive when they know what's coming and they understand what kinds of priorities are being engaged, especially if they feel like they're aligned with those kinds of things, which is not easy, but is, I think, a relevant point here. Um, just as a brief point, in doing some of these surveys in the past, I think I've been kind of surprised by findings that people are actually quite aligned on priorities. And I won't really explain this whole chart, but the point is just to say, when you
Sorry,
survey people,
your
yeah.
slides dropped off,
Oh
Emily.
no,
When
I'm
you,
so
yeah,
sorry.
just sorry. Yeah, I mean, you're making
Thank
absolute
you.
sense. So just sorry,
Thank you.
probably a
Okay,
couple back. Yeah.
I have one more, so let me just keep rolling. Thank you so much. Um, But yeah, generally speaking, people are really aligned on what their highest priority issues are. This doesn't necessarily mean that this is true for every project in every community, but sort of in general, people kind of agree things like drinking water is important, education quality is important, those types of things. In many countries, including the US, we see climate change as probably being a lot more politically aligned than maybe what people actually think about some of the outcomes, which is a whole other issue. But I personally, at least, have been pretty surprised at the diversity of places where people do remain pretty aligned on what broadly they want to see going on, which is essentially a good future for everybody. But in general, I think the maybe the closing point that I'll make here is that we do actually need a lot of attention to make sure that policies align with both people's needs and climatic needs. So thinking about this point that this is a normative transition, we are actually committed to reaching zero carbon if we are trying to address climate issues. And then within that, also really trying to account for what people prefer, what people need, these types of things. This is not an easy thing to do, but I think really starting from this point that we have an end goal and also within that we really want to center people is I think probably one of the more powerful pathways that we can see going forward. So I'll close there. Actually, this is kind of funny. I use this photo a lot for my closing. This is actually over one of the coal mines in Marnbah, so appropriate for tonight maybe. But point being, yeah, this is a big problem. It requires a lot of coordination, and it's going to be really interesting to work through this and hopefully steer the ship towards something a little bit better. So I'll stop there, and then I see some Q&A coming in. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. That was fantastic, Emily. And I think, so I was making furious notes because so many things that you were touching on really resonated with the experience we have here in Australia, I think, as well. So, yeah, there's so much to unpick, I think. But one of the things I just wanted to, which, you're talking about the planning, right? And, to me, there's this need for strong leadership. We have a similar thing with federal versus state. Based on all of the work you've done so far, what do you believe is the biggest challenge to make sure governments stay true to the long game? Because I think, that central, yeah, I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question and probably one of the harder ones. I think personally, I think that this is really an organizing problem and a political problem in more ways than it's a technical problem at this point. And that notion that you actually need to be committed to reaching an end goal that you're not going to waver from and that people are really convinced you're going to achieve is probably the hardest piece of this. How you do that, I think, is really largely via coalition building and really getting to a point where it's very, very clear what kinds of outcomes result from different pathways up to the point where people kind of understand why you care about climate. I do a lot of work on people's attitudes toward different environmental and social outcomes. And one of the things that always kind of stands out to me is that even in places, especially certain parts of the US, are pretty skeptical of climate change. I think this is a condition that you also have. The kinds of things that people are worried about are all impacts of climate change, but they don't really talk about them that way. And so there's, I think, a huge opportunity to do a lot more coalition building around really preventing some of these outcomes and trying to reach some of the better ones too, because it's not all about preventing bad. Given that this is kind of a reorganization of the energy and industrial system, there are huge opportunities to really build something better as well.
Yeah. I think one of my our colleagues, EQ Matthew Hornsey, has sort of early worked sort of showed that actually, often talking about sustainability, it can bring much more alliance to thinking around moving forward compared to climate change, which tends to sort of push these diverse views and so forth. And it was interesting to look at the priorities that you came through. There's lots of questions coming through. I just wanted to um, ask another one because I can, because is around based on your advice on how do we manage competing ideologies around this maintaining business as usual because it's too hard and too challenging. You talked about planning. What else do we need to sort of uplift to try and get that momentum?
Yeah, I think, and again, I apologize. This is a really, really American perspective because we have essentially no social safety nets. Um, and I bring that up just because, as a little bit of an example, the competing ideologies that I think I deal with the most are really around dramatically different understandings of what the future might look like. And people get really worried about losing their jobs. The reason I bring this up is because in the United States, your healthcare is tied to your job. And that's
Hmm.
probably one of the biggest impediments to people really trying to think about what this might look like. We have huge, huge challenges with anything that might lead to job loss, in part because of that real fear of losing your ability to seek healthcare. And so the reason that I again bring this up is that I think this really does come back to trying to make the problem bigger in a lot of ways. Climate change is obviously a huge problem already, but showing how some of these transformative opportunities actually do improve people's lives in other ways, I think is really important. And so mixing a lot of conversation around environmental outcomes with showing people how their lives are going to be better, I think is a lot more effective than basically trying to contradict one ideology over another, but essentially kind of saying, like, here's a vision, here's how we're going to get there, here's how we're going to protect against a lot of the really negative things that could come here. It's not necessarily managing competing ideologies so much as providing a vision that maybe attracts some people to yours in a way. So I'm not sure that that's the only way to do it, but at least here, I think there is a huge push and a huge opportunity to really just show people what's on the other side and how that could make people's lives better.
Mm, So that whole just transition, how do we manage? What was interesting for me was that, the coal collapsing all these other industries, because I think Australia definitely saw that as well in Hazelwood when that closed and caught people unaware. And I think, one example in Collie, I think they're working very hard, I know, to try and manage that transition in a way that avoids any of those shocks. And we are seeing, big batteries emerging alongside as the team there work really hard to manage that. I'll start. Some of these are not really questions, so we'll sort of. I won't go through all of them. Um, there's at the start. I'll just ask this one. Talking about fossil fuels used for energy, and that we'll swap these out entirely. Is there a world alternative where we can retain the usefulness of fossil fuels, where it makes sense, but mitigate the emissions which are undesirable? Using it as a feedstock for industry, chemicals, ammonia, high intensity heat. Any thoughts?
Yeah, great questions. I used to work for the U.S. government on carbon management issues, so carbon capture, carbon dioxide removal, those kinds of things. And I think one of the things that I always come back to, and again, civil engineer speaking, so I'm pretty infrastructurally oriented here. It's really, really hard to maintain a system that is able to provide a lot of those sort of secondary uses cheaply if you get rid of the major ones that are subsidizing it. So for oil, for example, we see a huge amount of chemical feedstocks coming from those systems as a I don't want to call it byproduct exactly because it's actually what keeps many refineries profitable, but you don't have the kinds of economies of scale that we currently see in our industrial system if you eliminate gasoline demand and diesel demand. I mean, even getting to the point of jet fuel, it's actually pretty difficult to keep part of that system without the whole one. I think there is a possibility that for some of these kinds of uses, medical devices, certain kinds of plastics, those types of things, you actually can pay much, much higher commodity prices that would be necessary to kind of preserve a really, really small scale industry compared to what we have now. But a system where you have $80 a barrel oil feeding into some of those systems just for the things that you want and not the things that you don't probably doesn't work. And I think the other place where this shows up in a lot of models is basically the assumption that a little bit of natural gas fired generation can be there as a backup. That has huge implications for not just the extraction side, but pipelines, these types of things. So, uh, in a word, I think for some types of applications, yes, but it might need to be the applications where you're willing to pay $1,000 to $2,000 a barrel of oil or something like that, like really, really back of the envelope, but potentially, yeah.
Yeah, so that's, I suppose this leads into Gabrielle's. How do we create an orderly energy transition for Australia, but I guess any that financially supports energy consumers with the uptake of renewables and someone that needs to eventually pay for the electricity grid infrastructure upgrades? It's a live thing that everyone's dealing with right now, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this is why I like to talk about the sort of long-term industrialized economies. I think you see this a lot in like Japan, Europe, like other places that have had these systems around for a long time is we've deferred maintenance for decades. And I think this is the other thing that goes a little bit unacknowledged sometimes. A lot of the transition issues that we're struggling with are partially because a lot of these systems are really old and haven't been maintained appropriately. That plus climate change plus an expectation of decline is kind of a really challenging situation to deal with. But all that said, like I think frankly, and this is where this gets really hard to talk about sometimes, and also why you need a really strong vision of where you're going, it's going to be more expensive for a while. And some of that is paying for climate change. Some of that is paying for other types of environmental and health issues that have been caused by these systems for a long time. But some of it is really just that there's, again, decades of deferred maintenance in some cases. What that looks like from an equity perspective, like, I don't know the Australian context quite as well. In the US, I think one of the things that I've been working a lot on lately is questions of how do you maybe transition some of this to public ownership. But there's I think a number of different governance structures that you could pursue here, but it's not going to be easy or cheap, and that's a really difficult message if you don't have a really compelling story on the other end.
Which I think gets to the political lens, right? Because, people don't, or politicians don't necessarily want to talk about the fact that it is going to cost to get to the going down. Uh, how can international coordination of transition survive political changes? Most countries have a problem of left, right, accept, reject the goal, or even the premise of the goal. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean,
Yeah,
solve the problem for the world, Emily? No.
no, truly. And I mean, I don't know. That's really hard. I think the thing that I bring up a lot because I teach environmental and climate justice to undergrads, and I think this is something that we talk about a lot in that context when a lot of them are kind of realizing suddenly like this is actually really hard. There's not a clear-cut answer. What's so challenging about this is that the sort of continuing on the path that we're on, I think, has essentially no chance of succeeding at providing the kind of future that most people agree that we want. Changing that is really risky, but maybe it puts on us on a path where there's at least a chance that we make it. I think with a lot of the coordination questions, there's a little bit of a sense that has been relatively well debunked by communication scholarship at this point that if you just sort of wait for an event that's bad enough, everybody will sort of snap to attention and proceed. I don't think that that's realistic. And so, yeah, this is a huge political problem. And this is, I think, why this really comes back to this notion that this is not really a place where we need technology research so much. Like that's still helpful, but this is primarily a question of organization and politics at this point, I think. And yeah, I don't have a good answer to that, but we're not spending enough time thinking about it, I think.
It was interesting. I was at a World Hydrogen Summit, and one thing that struck me there was this minister for Uruguay talked about the fact that 20 years ago they'd taken all of their energy planning outside of the political realm to separate alongside, where each political party was a part of that. And he sort of talked about 99% plus renewable now there.
Wow.
And he said one of his words was, as soon as we did that, people trusted the decisions that were being made. So I think it's a
Wow.
really interesting consideration. I mean, obviously
Um,
politicians have oversight and leadership, but is there a structure that can exist that actually helps that? So I really think it's worth thinking about how to do that in some format, especially to be able to have the frank and fearless conversations that need to be had with communities about that. You sort of touched on this when you mentioned steel, and someone was interested to know, that example, but Ed Stokes. So are there any other industry transitions that we've experienced that are analogous to this one we're about to face that we could potentially learn lessons from, maybe around the industrialization period? Because I know even with talking with some of our industry, it's like we want to work, maybe looking at hubs, but show us one that's been commercial that actually works. So
Yeah.
any thoughts on that or reflections?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a great question. And I think it's one that anyone working in this area gets a lot. I think the short answer is no. Like we've never actually had to do something that's so embedded not just in industrial economies but also people's daily lives at this scale before. And part of that is just that the world is bigger than it has been in the past, but part of it I think this is different in the sense that we are intentionally deindustrializing in a really significant way, as well as then immediately reindustrializing into a completely different system. That's not something that we've really had to do before. And there are a lot of useful analogies. So, what we saw with various countries actually really seeing their steel industries transition. I think one of the other ones that comes up here quite a bit, and also I think in England and some other parts of Europe, is the transition of the textile industry, sort of at the end of the 1700s or so, just in watching how that started to give way to more mechanization types of things. We also get, I think, a lot of conversations around demilitarization, like what happens when you demobilize after a major war. That kind of thing starts to look a little bit more analogous. But there again, like there's nothing where we've really had so much of a system in one particular path for over a century, pretty much not everywhere. And obviously, there's still major energy access questions around the world that are really significant. But just the way that this industry is kind of integrated into everything is, I don't want to call it unique necessarily, but it's not something that we've seen before. All of that said, I think one of the things that I also like to say a lot is we also haven't convinced ourselves, or we don't have a lot of examples of this failing either. We haven't tried it before. And so I think sometimes when we say we don't have a lot of good examples, that sounds like we don't have any ideas of what might work. We also don't have examples of the kinds of things that people propose failing just because we haven't really seen a lot of this before. So we have a lot of, I think, analogies that can be used. We have a lot of lessons learned about big transitions. What that actually looks like in practice, this is kind of going to be a one-shot thing, I think, because of that issue of both subtraction and addition that we're facing.
Yeah, I think you're obviously there's so many questions coming through. I'm just trying to pick through ones that are a little bit different or whatever. But Darcy Eaton says, "Thank you, Emily, for sharing your insights. As an export-oriented small open economy, i.e., price taker, how can Western Australia manage our mid-transition, given we're quite beholden to external economic factors? Are there any planning tools that we in government consider when looking into industrial transition? And then with respect to infrastructure, do you have any insights into the priority infrastructure requirements or even staging of these from either a US or global perspective?" So some big questions there,
Yeah,
but
great question.
yeah,
Yeah.
fantastic.
Maybe I'll take the second half first, just in terms of priority infrastructure requirements and staging. I think the thing that I keep coming back to is services first. And what I mean by that is I care a lot more about designing a system around ensuring that people definitely have heat and definitely have transportation and those kinds of things than exactly what that looks like. The US has been in a very subsidy mood for a while, and that ends up actually hitting very much on sort of the supply side and sort of the industrial actors much more than it does on people. And I think that because this transition is going to take a while and is something that's so relevant for people, the more that that staging can really emphasize making sure that those services are available, even if it means like an inefficient use of resources in some ways or slightly increased emissions for a little while because you have duplicative infrastructure and those kinds of things. Like really making sure that those critical services are going to be available for people is so important for creating trust that I think it's actually worth really over investing in some of those things. If you fail at some of the kinds of things you might be looking for, you still have people receiving the services they need. And so making sure that that's the first thing, I think, is actually usually where I start. So things like building repairs and ensuring people have housing and that housing is in good repair and those types of things. Like I tend to start there much more than I start at, well, we need this much hydrogen to go into this particular kind of application. In terms of, yeah, being a price taker, that's also a really fascinating question that like most places have that condition, at least in some ways. And what's, I think, interesting about it is, again, this notion that we actually have so much information about the particular infrastructures that we have that you can get pretty specific in thinking about what planning tools maybe are available. So even if you're a price taker, like, it's these power plants, this refinery, these mines are going to be the ones that are affected. How do you really understand what you need in those situations? Like, do you need to make sure that you have this amount of electricity and this number of people have jobs and like those kinds of things? You can get pretty specific pretty quickly, even if you don't have control over the full economic system. The downside, obviously, with a lot of this stuff is, again, I do think that this transition period is going to be more expensive than the beginning or the end. Again, mostly because you're paying for two infrastructures and you probably want to overpay a little bit to avoid really significant hazards. That's challenging, but I don't think it's unsurmountable, basically.
So I think financing and the way that we do this is actually really critically important, and actually coming up with new ideas that aren't just handouts and so forth. And there's a lot of conversation going on about that in our state and also, as we know. Richard asked, fossil fuels are subsidised 4 times more than sustainable energy. Would it be better, given backlash to any renewable funding, to simply advocate for all subsidy removal? Have you looked at that in any of your work at all around the subsidy question? It's, because it
Yeah,
is an interesting one that comes up, right?
a little bit. Yeah, and I think I've gone too far off the other end. I don't think that market-based policies are that helpful anymore. Like I think that there have been some really good pieces written about how you subsidize different kinds of things at this point, because we're not trying to reduce emissions, we're trying to eliminate them. I care a lot less about what's market efficient at each individual stage of change. I care about how I'm going to make sure that people have the services that they need. And so that might not be the same order that a market would give me. Because of that, I think the subsidy question, yeah, maybe eliminate them, maybe don't. The financing obviously is going to be challenging to disentangle from the way that we do this, but I don't think market-based solutions are going to be particularly helpful here, because essentially anytime you're trying to have a market do some of these things, you're going to run into issues where you're going to need to intentionally distort the market to get the outcome you want, like not turning the lights off on people and stuff like that. I think it's easier probably to just engage that directly and really have an open and frank conversation about which services need to be provided. And maybe those are not the cheapest ones to keep online for longest, but if they're the ones you need, then they're the ones you need.
So just building on that, we talk a lot about, there's a sort of missing narrative with broader community because everyone's just getting on with their life and trying to pay their bills and so forth. And obviously this, within our research realm, the sort of idea of place-based approaches is really important. What are your thoughts around, that building trust and getting people on board to think about the priorities? How has that been considered in sort of the research that you've seen? I think it would be interesting for us to hear about that too. Thanks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think most places do this pretty poorly, actually. But the the things that I've seen that seemed more effective, I think, are the ones that are more honest about what's coming and really have a very direct conversation about what some of those options are. I think a lot of the time the rhetoric tends to be sort of, if we keep doing what we're doing, everything's going to be fine. And otherwise, we're going to do this other thing that's really disruptive. Which thing do you want? And people are kind of like, why would I do the disruptive thing? I don't think we talk enough about the fact that going down the route that we're on is going to continue to be increasingly and probably accelerating in disruptiveness and challenges, both from economic perspectives, health problems, safety problems, these kinds of things. And so I think really engaging people very, very directly of these are the consequences that we expect we're going to see. Here are the kinds of solutions that we know could fix these kinds of problems that we're expecting. Here are the issues that we probably need to mitigate. Like, let's talk about what we're going to do with that. Those are the kinds of things that I've seen, I think, bring people into conversation a lot more directly. Obviously, that takes somebody actually being willing to say it. And I think the examples that I've seen where this has worked have been pretty small, just probably because there's a little bit more of a trust-based relationship in places where people know each other a little bit better already. So how you replicate that at a big scale, I think is challenging. But these ones where people are just like, look, like the town is going to lose a ton of revenue in either 8 years or 12 years. Like, let's talk about that. That I think tends to be more effective.
And I think those conversations also have to elevate to some of the industry as well, who are really trying to decarbonize. So how do we help that happen? As you say, it might be a specific intervention. I'm going to ask this question because obviously you're in the US and we're all intrigued and watching as things go on because
Oh my
every day is
gosh.
different, right?
I'm so
So
sorry.
no, no, it's entertaining. Sometimes. Hugh Finn asked, he said a great presentation, and there's a great quote about states in the US federal system being laboratories of democracy. Do we get a US that is half transitioned, like California and the Northwest and the Northeast, but then the rest of the country does not? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, maybe. And I'm calling you tonight from a state that's still 50% coal-based. That's one of the highest in the country. So yeah, like it is a pretty different situation depending on where you are. I will say, I think sometimes the states that are doing a lot are surprising to people. It's not entirely just the West Coast in particular. Like there are a few places that actually really have some very intriguing policies to be watching. Whether those remain durable, I think, is another question. And like California itself, I think, is also interesting because it has this reputation for being very, very driven on a lot of these climate issues, but it's really struggling with a lot of the very particular implementations of that. I think it's probably more because they're further along than other places than that they're actually failing necessarily. But, you know, it's a pretty big oil producer, those kinds of things. But yeah, in terms of what the transition actually looks like, I think that's kind of the road we're on. What's frustrating about that is that that means that the transition will have failed. Like as and this is also partially why I tend to be kind of skeptical of subnational voluntary market-based solutions. Basically, one state stops using a resource, another one is able to pick it up. Like that isn't always true. There are issues of like which resources can who use and those kinds of things. But yeah, I mean, there's a version of the world where one state stopping using coal basically just means that another state buys that power plant. And in fact, that's actually what we've been seeing. Like so the kinds of market segmentation that we see that basically results in no infrastructure change, but on paper means that some states have effectively transitioned more than others is definitely visible here. I hope we get a few more states that get more successful at actually doing some of the hard infrastructural transition as opposed to, you know, like offsets and these kinds of things so that they're examples, because I think that we do also tend to see a lot of states acting as followers here. There's so many of them that, you know, if one state proves that something is possible, it's a lot easier for others to follow. So I do hope that we see progress.
And I think that's the beauty of actually tracking and monitoring. And I think that's WA as a standalone system is a perfect test bed for innovation. It may not all work, but we can learn from that. We're just about out of time, I recognise. I just want to go back to, you talked about, you know, accelerating mid-transition is going to be hard, expensive, difficult to manage and hazardous. I think what I love about you as an engineer, you're focusing on the people side. And so how do we make sure that we keep those just principles at the front end of it, just maybe to close that out? In your mind, what are the things to make sure that happens?
Yeah, I mean, this is also something that I emphasize to my students a lot. Like the civil engineers have a code of ethics that essentially says, above all else, protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. And why do you do this if not to protect people and to make sure that people are able to thrive? And yeah, I think there are a lot of ways that we can fail that don't harm people as much as some of the other ways that we can fail. And so coming up with ways to fail gracefully, I think is maybe one of the more noble challenges of our time as technical people sometimes.
Mm. Okay, that's all the time, and that you must be ready for bed. But thank you so
Thank
much
you
for
so
sharing your
much.
insights, and looking forward to keeping the collaboration going. Obviously,
Yeah,
we'll send you all the questions, and
thank
yeah,
you.
we'll keep in touch. And thank you very much for sharing the time with us. Really
Yeah,
great.
thank you so much for joining. It's been really
All
a
right.
pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Perfect. Take care. See you.